I'll turn it over to Debbie and Cindy to give an overview and a presentation on housing rules and regulations in San Ramon.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll give Cindy a minute to upload our PowerPoint presentation. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're going to talk about housing in San Ramon, a little bit about the process, some of the recent, and we'll talk about the process, the state influence on state legislation influence on housing, SB 330, and how San Ramon really plans for housing, and specifically our upcoming regional housing needs allocation process, which Cindy will be providing that overview for you all. So I just want to kind of start out with that housing has become a very prominent issue for every city and county in California. And through the development review process, or planning process, as we call it, is how cities meet their housing obligation. Housing legislation came to the forefront in 2017 with a package of 15 bills designed to increase the production of housing through providing funding for affordable housing, streamlining the review and approval process for housing, increasing accountability and reporting requirements for local governments, and preserving our existing affordable housing stock. As I mentioned, there were a number of bills that came through in 2017. Going into effect in January 2020 was SB 330, which is our latest housing production bill. And while housing projects still require public hearings and city approval, SB 330 is really designed to streamline the public review process, which I'll get into in a few minutes. Next slide, Cindy. So San Ramon, for how we work in our development review process, we encourage all new projects, including housing, to utilize what's called a concept review process. This process really allows the property owner and applicant to solicit feedback from the city staff, the public, and the planning commission regarding a potential project. This process does end once the commission meeting is complete, and we provide comments back to the applicant for their consideration. Following the completion, the owner may decide to proceed with the project as originally proposed. They may modify the project based on the comments received from the commission or even from the public, and pursue an additional review for more feedback on a revised concept, which came out of that original concept review. I want to note that not all projects will proceed with the formal application. They may decide that they don't see it beneficial for them to go forward, or the city has identified significant issues for the project not to move forward. So it really becomes a business decision for that applicant to decide if they really want to move forward into the next steps. And so the next steps really consist of the entitlement process. This is the formal review process. And at that point in time, we get down really into the project's compliance with our zoning ordinance, our general plan, and our design review. We'll conduct an environmental review, basically to determine what the project's impacts may be on the environment from an air quality standpoint, greenhouse gas emissions, traffic, water quality, and the like. Through that process, we do have public engagement, which are public hearings and even public workshops, where we will invite the public in and solicit their comments for and against the project. Following the completion of our public hearings and providing staff reports to the commission will take an action on the project, and that decision really is based on findings which include conditions of approval. So basically the justification, how the project does or does not comply with the city codes and the general plan. Next slide, Cindy. So as mentioned by Councilmember Zafar, the City Council's goals is really to focus housing in the core of the city, placed next to jobs and retail shopping, and in proximity to our walking district that we are now developing. Preserve our open space and our existing neighborhoods. We have a number of strategies to manage growth in the city. The predominant one is our urban growth boundary, which limits growth to infill areas contiguous to the developed areas of the city. Second, our performance standards within our general plan, such as our level of service to ensure our intersections are operating at acceptable levels. And finally, our overall general plan, which creates our long-term vision for controlled and managed growth. So there are a number of key factors when we look at where we place housing to ensure it doesn't impact our open space or creep into our open space. And that's really where our urban growth boundary comes into play, because basically the urban growth boundary is the edge of urban development, and utility and urban services cannot be provided outside an adopted urban growth boundary. Next slide, Cindy. So with a bit of overview on housing in San Ramon, I want to talk a bit about the influences from Sacramento on housing production. And as I mentioned, Steve will continue the conversation and discuss our regional needs housing allocation process. So as we're all aware, the state of California has fallen behind in housing production. And the goal is focused on increasing housing production to house all levels of affordability. Cities can plan and improve housing, but has limited control over the construction of housing. Essentially, we have to identify those opportunity sites, but we do not construct housing. It's really market driven. And housing that is constructed may take many years to come to fruition. Doherty Valley, for example, was approved in Contra Costa County in 1992. We are now seeing in 2021 the final units being constructed. As with our recent approval of our City Walk project, it's 4,500 units, but that project will take 25 years for construction to complete. So housing, while it's approved in a certain year, it may take many, many years, depending on the scale of the project, to be completely built out and those units provided for our residents to purchase. Thank you, Cindy. So the next I really want to kind of touch on is SB 330. This is the latest housing production bill that is in effect, and it's in effect for 5 years and expires in 2025. And it is meant to expedite the approval process. It does apply to all cities in California and applies to all development that is consistent with the general plan, the zoning ordinance, and our subdivision standards, which means there is no personal or subjective judgment. We have to view these projects and review and consider these projects based on objective standards. So essentially, an example would be a really simple one is the color of the house that the developer wants to paint. They want to paint it a beige, but the city wants it to be a blue. Well, that is very subjective. Unless you have development or objective standards that say all houses in this subdivision or in the city are going to be an earth tone palette, that's something that we cannot really weigh in on the decision. We are very proactive as a city in working with the development community before they file an application, really discuss those nuances and those things that we know may be subjective through the process in order to come to some agreement that we feel will benefit our residents and help the project to move forward. Housing development under SB 330 is defined as an all residential project or a mixed use project where 2/3 of the square footage that is being constructed is for residential purposes and also transitional and supportive housing. Next slide, Cindy. Are you? Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. I am behind. There we go. So under SB 330, there are a maximum of 5 public hearings that are allowed for development of a project. And a public hearing is broadly defined as any workshop, public hearing, workshop, or similar meetings. So in San Ramon, we have a number of city committees that we like to have our housing projects go through: Architecture Review Board, Economic Development, if there's a mixed use project, our Housing Advisory Committee, our Open Space Committee potentially. But with SB 330, any of those meetings would be construed as a public hearing. So our intent is essentially to provide the Planning Commission with the ability to hold the most public hearings, which is up to 4. And we have to reserve 1 hearing for the city council in case there's an appeal on a housing project. So it has really limited the ability to have the input from our city committees in the housing project process. And one part of this SB 330 is the deployment application completeness. It allows the deployment application review process to lock in the rules, the regulations, and standards that are effective at the time that review process is filed for. And that's for 180 days. And so essentially during that 180-day waiting period, the developer can decide they want to proceed with a formal application. SB 330 also reduces the time to approve or disapprove a project to 60, 90, or 180 days, depending on the type of environmental review that we will be conducting. Next slide, Cindy. So if a housing development project complies with the city's standards is denied, the burden of proof is really on the city to demonstrate that the project would have a significant adverse impact on public health or safety. Essentially, SB 330 has made it very difficult for cities to deny a housing project to ensure that that housing is to move housing production forward. So essentially what is really well for the community is not a criteria for denial. So if we don't like the look of the housing project, we can't deny it just solely based on aesthetics. There has to be a public health and safety impact that we have documented and and the burden of proof is demonstrated by the city. And another means of denial is that there's no feasible mitigation to mitigate or avoid that identified adverse effect. And SB 330 does carry some teeth in that fines up to $10,000 to $50,000 per unit paid by the city if the court determines an inappropriate denial of a project, and the court may approve the project anyway. So if the city does act in a very subjective matter without burden of proof, that project is litigated and the city is found to inappropriate denied the project, there could be fines levied on the city and the project approved anyway. So there'd be a financial impact to the city and the project would still move forward. Next slide, Cindy. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Cindy Yee, and she's going to talk about the regional housing needs allocation process. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Debbie. So as Debbie mentioned, state law requires all cities to plan for the housing needs of everyone in the community. That planning effort begins with the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which we locally refer to as RHNA. RHNA kicks off an 8-year planning cycle in which cities must plan for the projected housing needs of San Ramon. The next housing cycle begins in 2023 and ends in 2031. So there are various levels of government that play a specific role in planning for housing. At the state level, the state identifies how many housing units the Bay Area must plan for over the next 8-year cycle. The Bay Area Regional Planning Agency for the Bay Area is called the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG. ABAG creates a methodology for how the units will be divided amongst the various cities and counties within the Bay Area. And San Ramon's role would then be to plan for and program the share of our RHNA that gets assigned to San Ramon. And we do that with the housing element update. The housing element is one of the chapters within the general plan that's required to be updated every 8 years in order for us to continue to remain accountable to state housing law. So once the city receives our regional housing needs allocation, our housing element programs for various income levels. These income levels are divided into 5 income ranges that range from extremely low income to above moderate. And that's based on the area median income for Contra Costa County. When one refers to affordable housing San Ramon, San Ramon defines affordable as those making an annual income of less than $100,000 per a one-person household. So in San Ramon, as you can see, professions that identify as a lower income household include a first-year teacher with a master's degree, a paramedic, or a restaurant cook. Anybody that falls above area median income would be considered moderate or above moderate. So oftentimes we get asked why the city plans for, why do we have to plan for more housing? And I think it's really important to look at it from a regional context. The Bay Area is lucky enough to be a region that's rich in jobs, and with any new jobs and new businesses, they're attracted to our area for various reasons. Over the next 35 years, the region is expected to add 1.4 million jobs through 2050. And in order to fill these jobs, there's an expected population growth that is needed of nearly 2.7 million people to be able to continue to support these jobs that are created. And as a result, because of the population increase, the cities and Bay Area have to plan for at least 1.5 million housing units over that 35-year cycle in order to be able to accommodate for that projected growth. And so as we talk about job growth, what we really have to look at is the job growth really is surpassing the amount of housing that we're actually constructing in the Bay Area. So you can see here in Contra Costa County, we're adding 5 new jobs for every 1 housing unit that is constructed. And every community within the Bay Area is seeing the same issue of adding more jobs, which is great, but not being able to catch up with the production of housing needs to support that job growth. From ABAG, San Ramon plays an important role in providing housing unit production. And in the Bay Area, ABAG projects that year over year, we're going to need to produce nearly 50,000 units in order to catch up to the job growth projection. As you can see, the Bay Area is producing housing units, but not at the level of projected units that we need to see. And so every year that we are not producing the housing numbers that the region needs, it only increases the pressure to build more housing through various means, one of which we've been talking about is legislation from the state. And there are many factors that contribute to the drop in housing production. We're still recovering from the effects of the Great Recession. As we all know, costs continue to rise, especially in construction, for materials, for labor, for land costs. And there's just a limited supply of land. We want to balance the needs of the community with parks and open space and retail and commercial development, but all of that needs to balance, and when you push in one direction, oftentimes you're then pulled in another one, and it's really a delicate balance to try to address this housing production concern. So in order to address this drop in production, what our region is seeing is an exponential increase in a need to plan for additional housing production in the Bay Area. So you can see here in our last housing cycle, the cycle that we're currently in right now, our 8-year period through 2023, the Bay Area is planning for about 188,000 units. In 2023 through 2031, that number is now going to increase to 441,000 units that the Bay Area has to plan for. Locally in San Ramon, we're seeing that same effect. And so our current cycle right now, San Ramon has to plan for about 1,400 units. And we're going to be then shifting in this next year cycle to a expected allocation of over 5,000 units that we'll have to plan for over the next 8 years. And I should say, not only are we planning for those 5,000 units, but we have to plan for those 5,000 units at various income levels. In our next RENA cycle, over 61% of the units that have been allocated to San Ramon have to be able to be affordable to those in the low, very low, and moderate income category. In this slide, you can just see the draft regional housing needs allocation for San Ramon and how we compare to other surrounding jurisdictions. Contra Costa County has been given, unincorporated Contra Costa County has been given an allocation of over 7,000 units. San Ramon at that 5,000 level, Walnut Creek, nearly 6,000. Danville has an allocation of 2,000 units. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that what that means in terms of the growth rate for those communities. San Ramon, based on the additional housing units that we produce, will have an increased growth rate of 18% over that 8-year cycle. And so because of the multi-year community engagement process, San Ramon is now in the process of preparing our housing element update. We're doing this in addition to a comprehensive general plan update so that we can make sure that we're tying housing with land use, with our growth management elements, with our safety and infrastructure obligations. So right now, the draft allocations have been provided to us by ABAG. The methodology is being finalized, and it begins an appeal process for the allocations that the city receives. By late 2021, later this year, the cities will receive our final RHNA allocations, which will then continue our process of multi-year engagement with the public through outreach and engagement, numerous other webinars such as this one, and receiving feedback through the public hearing process and workshops on what our community's goals and priorities are in terms of housing. Once all of that analysis is completed, including environmental review, the cities will have to adopt our housing element and submit those to the State Department of Housing and Community Development by late 2022. For our next 8-year cycle, San Ramon is really focused on a number of key factors. We're looking at our developable land area and really focusing development within the core of San Ramon, primarily infill opportunities and locations of properties that are closer to jobs, to services that currently exist and are planned for San Ramon. We also have an opportunity to look at additional housing opportunity sites. This map here shows our current housing opportunity sites in San Ramon. A number of these sites will have been developed after this current cycle that we're in. And so we will have to begin looking at new opportunities to be able to plan for those 5,000 units that San Ramon has been assigned. So in terms of our long-term goals, there are a number of tools that the city has to be able to address housing production and housing for all segments of the population. The city locally has an inclusionary housing ordinance and a commercial linkage fee ordinance that requires that with every new development that gets built, there's going to be a percentage of those units that are going to be set aside for those affordable income households. We also have a commercial linkage fee that also is tied to commercial development and the impact of new development on affordable housing. We also leverage state mandates that require cities to allow for density bonuses with projects, development of accessory dwelling units to increase housing production and to provide a variety of housing. And using tools like SB 330 and SB 35 that streamlines the review and approval process. There are a number of bills that are currently under consideration and will see some additional movement over the next year. There are a number of bills that are highlighted here that are addressing housing density and housing development and looking at opportunities and ways to continue this goal of increasing housing production. And really the bottom line is that, you know, in order to continue to maintain the jobs and maintain the population that's expected in the Bay Area, we really need to be focused on increasing housing production. And we're seeing a lot of the bills that are over the last few years and looking ahead, that they're really trying to address this increase of housing production, increasing housing sites that we may not typically consider as, you know, ideal housing sites. eliminating local restrictions such as the maximum number of public hearings that a city might be able to have, and also providing tools such as CEQA streamlining to reduce the amount of analysis that applicants and developers may have to go through if a city has already done some of that analysis. So there are a number of tools that are going to increase this housing production. San Ramon has done quite a bit over the last few years in trying to meet our regional housing needs allocation. I'm going to put in a shameless plug right now for one of our projects that is a for sale project in San Ramon. We're currently providing 28 affordable units that are for sales to the low and very low income households in San Ramon, and have an opportunity. If you're interested, please visit the city's webpage. You can get more information. Debbie and my contact information is available here as well, so that you can reach out. And if you have questions about any of the local programs that are in the city, or are in need of how to find housing, we are more than happy to help you with those questions.